Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line. We start out in the direction of Avdiivka, where we have seen that the Russian forces have managed to advance both to the west and to the north of Avdiivka. In the western direction, they advance slightly in the direction of Severine, where we take a closer look. We see that they have crossed through the forest line, and that's about it. They have gotten closer to the defenses in Severine. Likely they have crossed through some Ukrainian defensive positions here by the forest lines, and they're now conducting direct fire operations and fights face on against the Ukrainian defenders here to the east of Severine with the ongoing attacks here. So what we're currently seeing is that the Russian forces are looking to attack Severine and get control of that, which would cut off the southern routes in and out of Avdiivka, as we saw in my previous video, where I covered the supply lines in and out of Avdiivka. And here we see that one of the main ones goes through from Severine towards Avdiivka. And most importantly, it is directly to the citadel area here to the west of the city, which is the heavily fortified area, where the Ukrainians essentially have their best fortified and best position to overlook the fields here to the west of Avdiivka and allowing them to hold such a strong defensive position. So essentially what we're seeing is that the Russian forces continuously storm the southern parts in the direction of Severine, and the Ukrainian forces are holding and trying to defend as much as possible to prevent the Russian forces from getting and cutting off the supply line between Severine and Avdiivka at the citadel area. As for the northern parts, we see that the Russian forces advance slightly to the south of the waste heap area, and most importantly, they have captured this part here by the railways, which is one of the forest patches. And since then, there has been massive artillery preparations all throughout last night, and some operations during the night. And now here in the morning, the Russian forces started storming the coke plant to the west of the waste heap. So we're seeing that the Russian forces are now directly storming the coke plant, trying to gain control over it. So with this, we're going to be seeing the heaviest infantry-based fighting between the two sides since the Battle of Bakhmut, where we saw fighting within the city itself. So we're now seeing the Russian forces directly storming this coke plant to the north of Avdiivka. If the Russian forces manage to gain control over the coke plant, they will cut off the most important defensive position in Avdiivka, even more important than the citadel area here to the west of Avdiivka. The reason for this is that the main supply route in and out of Avdiivka goes through the south of the coke plant. So if the coke plant is taken under the control of the Russian forces, the main supply line will be cut, and most of the supplies going in and out of Avdiivka will be cut. There's also the southern supply route, which I just mentioned, but again, here the Russian forces are also storming Severine. So with this, all of the land routes would be cut off, leaving only the tunnels for the supply to Avdiivka. So we're currently seeing that the Russian forces, with the pressure on the coke plant and Severine, are now at a very crucial point in this battle of Avdiivka, because if the Ukrainians are able to hold them and be able to then counterattack, possibly pushing them away, then they'll be able to breathe again. But if the Russian forces continue to pressure and manage to capture the coke plant and Severine, then they will be suffocating. In the fighting taking place in the northern parts of Avdiivka, the Russian 114th Mechanized Brigade is currently fighting against the Ukrainian forces, and they recently released yet another video of them destroying another Leopard tank, this one a Leopard 2A6, to the north of Avdiivka. So we are now seeing the number of Leopard tanks destroyed by the Russian forces in this area numbering between 5 and 7 based on different reports. So we are seeing that the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 116th Mechanized Brigade, which they sent to Avdiivka to support the flanks, one to each flank in the north and the south, are suffering losses already, which shows that the fighting is very heavy and the armored capacity of the Ukrainian forces continues to dwindle. But comparatively, we still see that the Russian forces have lost a lot more in this offensive so far, as they lost a lot on the first few days of the offensive. But we also have to remember the 47th Mechanized Brigade has just gone through 5 months of fighting in their own offensive, which means that they are most likely exhausted at this point. We then move on to the southern parts of the conflict, where we see in the direction of the Kherson-Dnieper River area, the Ukrainian forces crossed the Dnieper River and occupied parts of the Krinky area here to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. So with this, we see now that the Ukrainian forces have gained a foothold in the Dnieper River area across and are now in the eastern parts of the Kherson region. So the fighting here continues, and the Russian forces are trying to kick them away out of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, but the Ukrainian forces have established a position that they're holding on so far. The situation here is developing continuously as we see the conflict spiral in the direction of the Kherson area, where we see the Ukrainian forces continuously throughout these past few weeks trying to cross over and gain a proper foothold across the Dnieper River so that they can launch long-awaited river offensive across the Dnieper River. But so far they have been unable to hold on to an area large enough for them to continuously supply the units across the Dnieper River, allowing them to gain a proper foothold and launch an offensive therefrom. Because so far it's not an offensive, it is offensive operations to gain a foothold, allowing them to launch an offensive. Moving on to the Zaporizhia front here to the west of Robotyne, the Ukrainian forces managed to advance a slight bit in the area of the trenches west of Robotyne. Just south of them, we see that they are now flanking the Russian trenches here located by the forest lines. So with this, they are now attacking from two directions, both to the south and to the north of these trenches, trying to push out the Russian forces. We're also seeing attacks directly through the trenches as they have gotten a foothold in the eastern parts of these trenches, moving westwards, so they're attacking them from three different directions. We then move further north from the north of Avdiivka to the direction of Bakhmut, where we here see reports of the Ukrainian forces launching further attacks south of Andreevka. So they are launching continuous attacks through the railways down to Zelenopilya, trying to flank the Russian defensive positions within the villages of Kurdyumivka and Zelenopilya here to the south by going through the railways in the cover of the forest patches to the right and left. And then we see that they are continuously pushing through the southern area, trying to gain a foothold and push the Russian forces back from the positions by the railways. And in the northern parts, there's also counterattacks by the Ukrainian forces towards the Russian forces in the direction of the Vasilivka, as they managed to advance a slight bit here by the forest lines west of the Vasilivka. And we see here that there's some territorial positional fights taking place to gain better positions on the Ukrainian side. As for the northern parts in the direction of the Kremenaya forest area in the Serbyanki forest, we see that the Ukrainian forces managed to counterattack and regain some positions they've previously lost in Russian attacks in this direction. So with this, we see that the fighting here continues in the Serbyanki forest area, and although the Russians have had momentum, it is now broken with the Ukrainian forces regaining lost positions. We then move further north to the direction of the Sinkivka area, where we here see that the Ukrainian forces managed to recapture some of the forest patches here to the northeast of the village. With this, the supply lines in and out of the village, both to the east, west, and south, are all under Ukrainian control, and thus the supply here is properly guarded. The fighting currently is very heavy throughout the front line, with multiple videos being released at essentially every hour of heavy fighting taking place in the Donetsk direction, both in the direction of Avdiivka and Bakhmut. Specifically, these two cities are seeing some terrible fights with heavy casualties on both sides. What we're currently seeing is that we're at a stage where the battle of attrition is picking up speed, and after 5 months of the Ukrainian offensive, the current situation is on the brink of a switch on the power balance that is too much for the Ukrainians to cope with. I say this because we are seeing two major packages for the support of Ukraine throughout 2024 being held up in both the United States and the EU, with the United States, where the new Speaker of the Republicans is so far refusing to allow the vote for a package of aid to Ukraine. And in the EU, both Slovakia and Hungary are now denying a further aid to Ukraine. So with this, we are seeing that there's hardly any new aid being rolled into Ukraine, despite the losses they have suffered throughout their offensive. And with this, we are seeing that they are not able to regain and replace the losses they've taken throughout the offensive. And at the same time, with the war ongoing in the Middle East, we see that there's less and less focus on Ukraine, combining all of this with the fact that the Russians are now initiating another Bakhmut, another meat grinder in Avdiivka. The situation looks very terrible for Ukraine, and this is something that is admitted by Ukrainian officials, because the situation is that dire. You cannot hide it. And that is why, unless Ukraine receives significant support soon, the Russian army has now recruited an additional 378,000 troops in 2023, besides the 300,000 mobilized. They are simply too many for the Ukrainians to deal with at this rate. And I'm going to end off my video with that. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.